If we resist change because it's more comfortable not to, then we will not come to grips with this problem. And that is our great challenge. And I'm sure we'll respond to it, but we're going to have a great many fights in the process.
In the 1970s, Edmund Muskie fought to pass the Clean Water Act, which centralized federal power, introduced ambitious goals, and encouraged citizens to become environmental stewards. Breaking through this legislative frontier changed our nation's fundamental assumptions about water.
Throughout American history, factories were the center of communities who depended on the jobs they provided. However, industrial progress exploits natural resources, including waterways, which are used to dispose of waste. Because of water's economic value, Americans saw the degradation of rivers as a necessary sacrifice.
You look at the river and it's blue today, or it's, green or red, or any, whatever chemicals they're tossing into the river, that's the color of the river.
Growing up on Maine's polluted Androscoggin River in the 1920s, Ed Muskie saw abuses of industry, but recalled that we didn't think about pollution. The word wasn't part of our everyday vocabulary, and it was hardly in the public dialogue.
Throughout the early 20th century, state governments sporadically addressed pollution, but water quality standards drove industry away.
States, essentially the states or localities would compete with each other economically. It was a mess.
The first national law to address water pollution was the 1948 Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which was weakly enforced and only applied to interstate waters. Still, pollution control remained a largely local issue as water quality was not deemed important enough for extensive federal regulation. For cleaner water, America's priorities had to change.
In 1959, Ed Muskie was elected to the U.S. Senate representing Maine. He supported industry, but believed in pollution control because America's growing population was putting too much pressure on its air and water resources. Man has burst upon the environment like an invader, destroying rather than using, discarding rather than saving, and giving the environment little chance to adapt.
Muskie became chair of the Subcommittee on Air and Water Pollution, created to address environmental degradation. There was little precedent for pollution legislation, so the committee held hearings nationwide to learn about scientists' growing concerns and create momentum for their work.
Muskie embraced his leadership role. What made him different from most of his equally liberal colleagues was his hands-on participation in law writing, his attention to detail, his willingness to do homework, and most of all, his patience. Nicknamed Mr. Clean, Muskie gained a reputation as the foremost legislative expert on environmental issues. His patience and dedication were essential.
He knew how to compromise, he knew how to negotiate, he was a great debater, but what he had the facts together, the figures that we gave him, all the data. He convinced his colleagues on the committee that he knew what he was talking about.
If you run up against a stone wall by moving in one direction, you move in another direction. These are the choices that you have to explore.
By supporting several bills, Muskie gradually nationalized pollution control. The 1965 Water Quality Act expanded federal funding for water treatment plants and research, but didn't hold industry accountable. Stronger legislation was needed to truly improve America's waters.
One significant step towards environmental legislation was about air, not water, because air pollution was inescapable.
What we're doing here is the consequence of our failure to do what needed to be done in the past. And at some point it was bound to come to a crunch, and that's where it now is.
Muskie led the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970, which set strict emission standards, targets, and deadlines for industry. These strategies would become the groundwork for a whole new generation of legislation.
These acts corresponded with a shift in public opinion starting in the 1950s. Economic stability allowed people to look past the environment as an economic commodity and place value on natural beauty, public health, and recreation. The concept of ecology, reflected in works such as Silent Spring, promoted the idea of an interconnected environment in which the degradation of one ecosystem has wide-reaching consequences. In decades and ages past, it was master the wind, conquer the land, and tame the oceans. Now we know that we will have defeated ourselves if we overpower the total environment.
Without clean water or clean air, our environment is, greatly impacted. In all the organisms that live in the environment.
Mass media spread stories of environmental destruction, shocking the public, who then demanded a larger federal presence and a punitive approach to big polluters.
There is nothing like a public event or a public crisis to motivate politicians to get in front of the parade. And Muskie strongly believed in taking advantage of public momentum.
He was at a time that people finally had enough and things were changing.
After the success of the Clean Air Act, Muskie championed a new bill to address water pollution, emphasizing ecology. The Clean Water Act entered the frontier of environmental legislation by increasing federal involvement, introducing ambitious goals, and promoting citizen activism. Muskie cultivated bipartisan support between the House and Senate, which allowed Congress to override a presidential veto and pass the act in 1972.
This act set strict regulations and standards for industry, once seen as unacceptable federal overreach. Previous pollution legislation supported state efforts, but the Clean Water Act centralized enforcement under the new Environmental Protection Agency. Enacted across the nation, the act removed the economic incentive for industries to desert communities who had strict water quality requirements.
It had to be equally distributed across the country. If we hadn't have done that, we would have had a huge economic disruption in many states.
The Clean Water Act focused on regulating point source pollution by setting discharge limits and requiring the best available filtering technology in factories. Unlike previous legislation, it didn't focus on who was responsible for cleaning up pollution, but rather emphasized a shared responsibility in preventing it.
Just leveled the playing field. Everybody had to do the same, no matter what the water quality was.
The Clean Water Act had ambitious goals, including a timeframe of zero discharge by 1985. It defined roles for the public, courts, and program administrators with a goal of swimmable, fishable water nationwide. These specifics were necessary to eliminate the loopholes that plagued previous legislation.
The act empowered Americans by including a provision for citizens to sue polluters in violation of the standards. This created a sense of environmental stewardship because citizens now had the tools to advocate for and protect the rivers.
Today, the Clean Water Act is still the primary law used to enforce pollution control and maintain U.S. waterways.
It's a marvelous piece of law that amazes me that they were able to pass it.
The Clean Water Act had to be passed because it put teeth into what we wanted to have happen.
All of the goals have not been met, but significant progress has been made. Today, we have cleaner water and cases of waterborne illnesses have decreased. There is a greater understanding of the effect of human activities on waterways, and the expectation is that polluters are held accountable. Through recreation, people engage with rivers and lakes, resulting in awareness about the importance of aquatic health.
However, we still face many challenges.
That's how things have changed and continue to change. The job's not done yet.
Plastics and chemicals still pollute our land and water, and climate change threatens human health worldwide.
There's no end, in my opinion, to environmental protection.
Rather than viewing these issues as local problems, the federal government is expected to take a leading role.
The Clean Water Act was a significant step in the larger movement of reevaluating Americans' roles in protecting water and the environment. Muskie's dedication, patience, and skills as a congressman were crucial to crossing this legislative frontier.
It was a little bit like putting together a puzzle without borders, and finding the pieces that made up the puzzle was difficult, but I think for the most part they managed to cover it.
Because of its ambitious goals and strict standards, the Clean Water Act is a legislative achievement. It expanded the federal government's role in environmental protection and propelled a cultural shift away from prioritizing the economy over human and environmental health and towards viewing water as a shared resource.
It just took people to gradually realize that we need to do something to make our Earth better.
Traditionally, the word frontier evokes images of a wilderness to be conquered, but the Clean Water Act is an example of a frontier in which cultural views shifted away from exploitation towards appreciation of the environment. It is difficult to imagine our country in which we would allow industry to once again turn the rivers green or red. People have embraced shared ownership of our precious natural resources. However, frontiers by their very nature expand, and today our priorities have shifted as we face new environmental challenges. It will take patience, dedication, and vision to find solutions. The Clean Water Act demonstrated that the best solutions will inspire people to not only see the environment as it is, but to envision what it can be.